2 months ago, I went to a crush at the Lady Brandon's. Pause. A crush is a party. You ever been at a party where people are so crushed together that they can't move? It was a really, really crowded party. They called it a crush in Victorian times. I went to a crush at Lady Brandon's. You know, we poor artists have to go show ourselves in society from time to time, just to remind the public that we are not savages. With an evening coat and a white tie, as you once told me, anybody, even a stockbroker, can gain a reputation for being civilized. Well, after I had been in the room about 10 minutes talking to huge overdressed dowagers and tedious academicians, I suddenly became conscious that someone was looking at me. I turned halfway round and saw Dorian Gray for the first time. When our eyes met, I felt that I was growing pale. A curious sensation of terror came over me. I knew that I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. That's huge, right? So this is an influential figure. From the first second he sees him, Basil knows that Dorian is going to influence him, and he's trying to avoid influence. I think that's interesting. I did not want any external influence in my life. You know yourself, Harry, how independent I am by nature. I have always been my own master, had at least always been so till I met Dorian Gray. Then, but I don't know how to explain it to you. Something seemed to tell me that I was on the verge of a terrible crisis in my life. I had a strange feeling that fate, capital F, fate had in store for me exquisite joys and exquisite sorrows. I grew afraid and turned to quit the room. It was not conscience that made me do so. It was a sort of cowardice. I take no credit to myself for trying to escape. Conscience and cowardice are really the same things, Basil. Conscience is the trade name of the firm, that is all. It's a little offhand comment by Lord Henry. We could analyze literally everything that Lord Henry says. We shouldn't, because he's awful. But this idea that conscience and cowardice are the same thing, they have the same effect, so therefore there's no difference between them. Maybe that's a little bit of the realist, but, you know, it's sort of an immoral comment that, you know, takes something conscience, which is something that's moral and good, and equates it with cowardice, which is something that is to be looked down upon. And so the ultimate effect of this, and so many of Lord Henry's lines, is to undermine the things that society believes. I don't believe that, Harry, and I don't believe you do either. Again, there's Basil being romantic. He doesn't believe the evil thing that Lord Henry says. Lord Henry has no negative influence over Basil, as opposed to a lot of other people that he knows, which I think is more, you know, is if Lord Henry's a Satan figure and Basil's a God figure, I think it sort of makes sense. Anyway, we'll keep going. However, whatever was my motive, and it may have been pride, for I used to be very proud, I certainly struggled to the door. Then, of course, I stumbled against Lady Brandon. "You're not going to run away so soon, Mr. Howard," she screamed out. You know her curiously shrill voice. "Yes, she is a peacock in everything but beauty," said Lord Henry. That's the horrible insult. What does a peacock have if it's not beauty? Take off its tail, what does it look like? Ooh, said Lord Henry, pulling a daisy to bits with his long, nervous fingers. I could not get rid of her. She brought me up to royalties and people with stars and garters and elderly ladies with gigantic tiaras and parrot noses. She spoke of me as her dearest friend. I had only met her once before, but she took it into her head to lionize me. I believe some picture of mine had made a great success at the time, at least had been chatted about in the penny newspapers, which is the 19th century standard of immortality. Suddenly I found myself face to face with a young man whose personality had so strangely stirred me. We were quite close, almost touching. Our eyes met again. It was reckless of me, but I asked Lady Brandon to introduce me to him. Perhaps it was not so reckless after all. It was simply inevitable. We would have spoken to each other without any introduction, I am sure of that. Dorian told me so afterward. He too felt that we were destined to know each other. "And how did Lady Brandon describe this wonderful young man?" asked his companion. "I know she goes in for giving a rapid precis of all her guests. I remember her bringing me up to a truculent and red-faced old gentleman covered all over with orders and ribbons, and hissing into my ear in a tragic whisper which must have been perfectly audible to everybody in the room the most astounding details. I simply fled. I like to find out people for myself, but poor Lady Brandon treats her guests exactly as an auctioneer treats his goods. She either explains them entirely away or tells one everything about them except what one wants to know." "Poor Lady Brandon, you are hard on her, Harry," said Hallward listlessly. "My dear fellow, she tried to found a salon and only succeeded in opening a restaurant. How could I admire her? But tell me, what did she say about Mr. Dorian Gray?" "Oh, something like, 'Charming boy, poor dear mother and I absolutely inseparable, quite forget what he does, afraid he doesn't do anything.'" There's a commentary on, Victorian elite and society. "Oh yes, he plays the piano, or is it the violin, dear Mr. Gray?" Neither of us could help laughing, and we became friends at once. Laughter is not at all a bad beginning for a friendship, and is far the best ending for one, said the young lord, plucking another daisy. That's an aphorism, you know. He loves to put those out there, a little short, witty statement of truth. Hallward shook his head. You don't understand what friendship is, Harry, he murmured, or what enmity is for that matter. You like everyone. That is to say, you're indifferent to everyone. How horribly unjust of you, cried Lord Henry, tilting his hat back, and looking up at the little clouds that, like raveled skeins of glossy white silk, were drifting across the hollow turquoise of the summer sky. You see the artistry just in the little details there? Yes, horribly unjust of you. I make a great difference between people. I choose my friends for their good looks, my acquaintances for their good characters, and my enemies for their good intellects. A man cannot be too careful in the choice of his enemies. I have not got one who is a fool. They are all men of some intellectual power, and consequently they all appreciate me. Is that very vain of me? I think it is rather vain. I think this is interesting. Lord Henry categorizes people into three groups. Friends for their good looks. Why does he hang out with people who are good looking? Because people associate him with good looks. He chooses his acquaintances for their good characters. Why does he hang out with people who have good character? Because people think that he has good character because of his association with them. And then he chooses his enemies for their intellect. You know, that's interesting too, that he's vain enough to want to have people to spar with intellectually. I should think it was Harry, but according to your category, I must be merely an acquaintance. Now, Basil's pretty smart. He figures this out. He's like, wait, I'm not super attractive, so I can't be your friend. I'm moral, so I guess I'm an acquaintance. But then Lord Henry responds, my dear old Basil, you are much more than an acquaintance. The only other category is enemy. Is this a declaration of war between the two of them? Maybe, allegorically, it makes a whole lot of sense. And much less than a friend, a sort of brother, I suppose. Oh, brothers! I don't care for brothers. My elder brother won't die, and my younger brothers never seem to do anything else. Harry! Exclaimed Hallward, frowning. My dear fellow, I am not quite serious, but I can't help detesting my relatives. I suppose it comes from the fact that none of us can stand other people having the same faults as ourselves. I quite sympathize with the rage of the English democracy against what they call the vices of the upper orders. The masses feel that drunkenness, stupidity, and immorality should be their own special property, and that if any one of us makes an ass of himself, he is poaching on their preserves. When poor Southward got in the divorce court, their indignation was quite magnificent. And yet I don't suppose that 10% of the proletariat live correctly. I don't agree with a single word that you've said, and what is more, Harry, I feel sure you don't either. There it is again. Lord Henry stroked his pointed brown beard and tapped the toe of his patent leather boot with a tasseled ebony cane. Look at the details there. Pointed brown beard, Satan figure, I don't know. He's got tassels on his cane. Cool. How English you are, Basil. That is the second time you have made that observation. If one puts forward an idea to a true Englishman, always a rash thing to do, he never dreams of considering whether the idea is right or wrong. The only thing he considers of any importance is whether one believes it oneself. Now, the value of an idea has nothing whatsoever to do with the sincerity of the man who expresses it. Indeed, the probabilities are that the more insincere the man is, the more purely intellectual will the idea be. As in the case, it will not be colored by either his wants, his desires, or his prejudices. However, I don't propose to discuss politics, sociology, or metaphysics with you. I like persons better than principles, and I like persons with no principles better than anything else in the world. Tell me more about Mr. Dorian Gray. How often do you see him? Pause. Again, Lord Henry, uses intellect to suppress emotion. Emotion is connected with morality. To be intellectual is to escape morality. I think he's coming across here. He says at the end of this, he just sort of slips it in that he likes persons better than principles, and he likes people without principles better than anybody else. That's interesting. Anyway, the question here is, how often do you see Dorian Gray? And Basil replies, every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He is absolutely necessary to me. Pause. Go back to the secret of my soul. Go back to sort of like that undercurrent of homosexuality that might be going on with him. Anyway, how extraordinary. I thought you would never care for anything but your art. He is all my art to me now, said the painter gravely. I sometimes think, Harry, that there are only two eras of any importance in the world's history. The first is the appearance of a new medium for art, and the second is the appearance of a new personality for art also. So Basil separates things into two different eras. One is like when a new medium showed up, like when oil painting became a thing. Before that, there weren't oil paintings, or when three-dimensional sculpture became a thing. Before that, there were only frescoes. And the other is a new personality for art. And I think that's interesting because if you look at eras of art, look at Greek sculptures, for example, they all look the same. They try to capture the same idea, the same personality. They have the same soul. Same is true for Renaissance portraits. There's sort of a commonality to the picture itself. And so what Dorian is to Basil is primarily the second. It's that new soul. It's for the new age. This is the new Mona Lisa, the picture that's going to encapsulate Victorian art for all time. And that comes across here. Now, we're going to have some more Greek allusions and things like that coming up. I'm just going to read this and not analyze it too much. Let's see. What the invention of oil painting was to the Venetians, or the face of Antonius was to late Greek sculpture, the face of Dorian Gray will someday be to me. It is not merely that I paint from him, draw from him, sketch from him. Of course I have done all that. But he is much more to me than a model or a sitter. I won't tell you that I am dissatisfied with what I have done of him, or that his beauty is such that art cannot express it. There is nothing that art cannot express. And I know that the work that I have done since I met Dorian Gray is good work, the best work of my life. But in some curious way, I wonder, will you understand me? His personality has suggested to me an entirely new manner in art, an entirely new mode of style. I see things differently. I think of them differently. I can now recreate life in a way that was hidden from me before. A dream of form in days of thought. Who was it that said that? I forget. But it is what Dorian Gray has been to me. The merely visible presence of this lad, for he seems to me little more than a lad, though he is really over 20. His merely visible presence, I wonder, can you realize all that that means? Unconsciously, he defines for me the lines of a fresh school, a school that is to have in it all the passion of the romantic spirit, all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek, the harmony of soul and body. How much that is! We, in our madness, have separated the two and have invented a realism that is vulgar, an ideality that is void. Harry, if you only knew what Dorian Gray is to me! You remember that landscape of mine, for which Agnew offered me such a huge price, but which I would not part with? It is one of the best things I have ever done. And why is it so? Because while I was painting it, Dorian Gray sat beside me. Some subtle influence passed from him to me. And for me, the first time in my life, I saw in the plain woodland the wonder I had always looked for and always missed. Basil, this is extraordinary. I must see Dorian Gray. Hallward got up from his seat and walked up and down the garden. After some time he came back. Harry, he said, Dorian Gray is to me simply a motive in art. You might see nothing in him. I see everything in him. He is never more present in my work than when no image of him is there. He is a suggestion, as I have said, of a new manner. I find him in the curves of certain lines and the loveliness and subtleties of certain colors. That is all. Then why won't you exhibit his portrait? Asked Lord Henry. Because, without intending it, I have put into it some expression of all this curious artistic idolatry. That means he idolizes Dorian Gray, so make that connection as well. But the world might guess it. So what's he afraid of? He's afraid of the fact that people might understand or guess that he idolizes Dorian, might think that he's maybe homosexual. So maybe on some level, if Oscar Wilde's homosexual and this book is about art and Oscar Wilde's about art, maybe there's some underlying tension about Oscar Wilde and what he's hiding from the world and what he's afraid that books like this might reveal to the world, and maybe why he wouldn't, well, he obviously did, publish it. Anyway. But the world might guess it, and I will not bare my soul to their shallow, prying eyes. My heart shall never be put under their microscope. There is too much of myself in the thing, Harry, too much of myself. Poets are not so scrupulous as you are. They know how useful passion is for publication. Nowadays, a broken heart will run to many editions. I hate them for it, cried Hallward. An artist should create beautiful things, but should put nothing of his own life into them. We live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography. We have lost the abstract sense of beauty. Someday I will show the world what it is, and for that reason the world shall never see my portrait of Dorian Gray. I think you are wrong, Basil, but I won't argue with you. It is only the intellectually lost who ever argue. Tell me, is Dorian Gray very fond of you? The painter considered for a few moments. He likes me, he answered after a pause. I know he likes me. Of course I flatter him dreadfully. I find a strange pleasure in saying things to him that I know I shall be sorry for having said. As a rule, he is charming to me, and we sit in the studio and talk of 1,000 things. Now and then, however, He is horribly thoughtless, and seems to take a real delight in giving me pain. Then I feel, Harry, that I have given away my whole soul to someone who treats it as if it were a flower to put in his coat.